So as of last Friday, I have officially passed my PhD. I did my viva on video conference call, of course, it was kind of a strange way to do it. So your viva is your oral defense of your PhD thesis. Basically, once you submit your PhD thesis, it then goes to two examiners, one from within the university and one from outside, from another university usually. The two of them go away and read it, and then you come back and you have this meeting to discuss the thesis, discuss the outcome and their recommendations, but also crucially so that you can defend your thesis against any kind of criticism or questions that they might have. And it is a component of completing a PhD. You have to actually pass the viva. So I completed that with I passed with minor corrections, which was basically the best case scenario that I, expected to have going into that. In theory, you can pass without any corrections, but it's relatively unheard of. It's pretty rare, certainly in my department and in my experience anyway. It's, incredibly rare that you would have a thesis that needs literally no any changes, no typos, no anything. So I was really, really pleased to be passing at that level. Finishing the PhD during lockdown, during COVID has been a challenge. It's been a pretty unexpected angle, a pretty unexpected side to this whole experience. So I thought what I might do in this video is just kind of briefly discuss what my feelings are about the PhD now coming towards the end of it. I've talked before about my topic of the PhD, so I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, and I am going to create content around this topic in the future. There's no point in trying to kind of unpack all of that in one short video. It would just be way too much. So I'll link the most relevant video. I think there was a fairly recent one that would be most relevant up above for you to go and check out if you're interested in that. But yeah, mostly I think I just want to talk about the experience of doing the PhD and some of the same stuff that I suppose I kind of talked about across the 4 years or the 5 years that I was studying religious studies, as an academic, and some of the kind of struggles that I had maintaining a spiritual practice alongside studying it academically, and just maybe any thoughts on that and any recommendations for anyone who does want to go into the academic study of religion in some way. I feel like it's time to kind of do a wrap-up video on all of those kind of concerns that I've had in the past. Like I say, if you've been following me through the whole journey, maybe this will be a little bit repetitious, but you might be interested to hear, where my thoughts are at this point in the journey now that it's actually very, very almost come to a complete close, because I'm kind of almost done with my corrections. So you'll probably already know that my PhD thesis was on the Dark Goddess. And in the end, what I ended up focusing on was all of the printed books that have the Dark Goddess in their title, and all of the YouTube videos that I could find at the time of research that had, again, that phrase, that term, Dark Goddess, in their title. And the YouTube video one is a little bit more uncertain because it actually is, there's no really good search functionality on YouTube, so I just kind of had to do as many searches as I could and be satisfied in the end that what I had was fairly a kind of complete set of what was available at the time. So I kind of wanted to restrict the data that I was using to an extent and not get kind of overly broad into looking at all sorts of material online, even though I could have done that, because there just was so much to look into with that material. If you're a person who has made YouTube videos on the Dark Goddess in the past, at the time that I was doing my research and so on, I made the decision. In the beginning, I was kind of planning on citing everyone and citing them as texts and maybe trying to get in touch with people to make sure that that was okay. But as time went on, it became clear that a lot of the videos that were in my research have actually been removed off YouTube since. And I realised that the only way that I was going to be able to be sure to protect everyone's identity and make sure that I wasn't kind of publicising any material that people no longer wanted to have online, but I was going to have to anonymise everything. So that is what I did. I anonymised, I kind of cited everything in a bibliography, but I anonymised everything so that it's set up in such a way that if you really wanted to go and find a certain video, if it's still in the public domain, you could actually search for it by its title. But if the video has been removed from the public domain, you will no longer be able to access that video. You won't be able to find it. You won't be able to figure out who created it and so on. So if you're someone who's thinking about doing digital research, in any kind of way, shape or form. The ethics around that, the ethical decisions that I made around that, that might be something that you want to think about. And it was a complicated decision for me to make, and it changed a lot over the process, but that's how I kind of landed. So I'm not going to go in too much to my ideas and to kind of my conclusions and so on. But I will say that just what the thesis ended up looking like was I had 2 kind of introductory chapters that were roughly an introduction and a lit review, sort of. So the lit review is kind of talking about discussing and outlining all of the kind of scholarly material on that subject. So normally you'd be kind of looking at other studies that have been done on your topic. In my case, there were no other scholarly research. There was one paper written, I think, in the 80s about the topic of the Dark Goddess, and that was it. So it was really just kind of the contextual stuff, like what had been written about kind of the New Age, but specifically certain ideas associated with the concept of the New Age that were relevant to the Dark Goddess. And the main one is kind of the self and the focus on the self in the Dark Goddess material. And that was one of the kind of focuses that I looked at. And also just the role of women and the prevalence of women in the alternative spiritual community. So I was looking at scholarly material that had addressed that. And then after that I did 2 chapters that were kind of really just discussing the themes that were in the material. So I was just outlining, who the Dark Goddess is, how she is presented in this kind of published material, and what the main themes were and so on that came out of that. And then after that I had 3 kind of discussion chapters that were kind of looking into all sorts of different themes, and I'm not going to try and explore all of that right now, but some of the interesting sides and angles were around sort of fear and monstrosity and themes of violence and stuff like that, which I find really interesting in association with the Dark Goddess and Dark Goddesses. And then there was kind of more discussion of the self and how the Dark Goddess is related to the self, and what that understanding is. And it's my understanding is that the Dark Goddess is associated with this idea of not only kind of finding an authentic self, but actually kind of almost constructing a self, developing a new kind of self-identity and so on. And then the last chapter was kind of focused on political implications, because there has been a certain amount of criticism in New Age scholarship and so on that, that the New Age is claiming to be counterculture, but it's not really. And some of that is a bit outdated. I feel like some of those arguments are maybe not, they don't feel super relevant to the community that I'm familiar with, because I don't feel necessarily like the alternative spiritual community is always making any big claims to direct political impact. I think many of us are politically involved, and I think a large amount of us are left-leaning, but I wouldn't say that there is kind of the same, this idea of these big claims to a specific form of countercultural ideals seemed a little bit outdated to me, and maybe wrapped up in sort of second wave feminism and so on. That is, like I say, maybe not quite topical, but I did want to kind of address that too, because obviously the Dark Goddess material, it does tend to address issues around patriarchy and environmental crisis and things like that. And I do think it's important as well to point out that just because a book or a YouTube video isn't calling for overtly political action or some overt kind of communal change or societal change, doesn't mean that there aren't political ramifications potentially, or that that material isn't calling for some important change on a higher level outside of just the self, and that there aren't kind of communal ramifications and benefits to people engaging with this kind of material and these kind of ideas. So that was something that I wanted to kind of theorize a bit as well. So yeah, that kind of is enough of what you need to know about the topic for right now. Like I say, I will be kind of reformulating this. I'm sure my thesis will be available in some shape or form in the future. I'm just not exactly sure how that's going to look at the moment. But yeah, that's what I spent the last 4 years doing. I've already talked quite a lot on the channel about the various different struggles that I had doing this. The master's year before I did my doctorate, it should have been the hard year, because that's the year, if any of you have ever done a taught master's degree, especially in the UK or Ireland, or I don't know if it's the same in other countries, they tend to be a bit brutal. You get 1 year and you do huge amounts of writing, and then you write a thesis at the end in the summer, and it's they are kind of, yeah, renowned for being really tough and just an awful lot of deadlines, huge amount of writing. So it is an awful lot of work, and it was an awful lot of work. But I actually thrived in the Masters, especially in the first semester. I was so excited to be doing something new, using my mind in a way that I hadn't used it in a long time, and finding out what scholars had been saying about religion, you know, in the past. I don't know, mostly we're looking, I suppose, at the past kind of 20 to 30 years, but beyond that as well. It was very exciting. But there's a huge kind of social aspect to especially a master's program, because there are a lot of other students, you know, not only in my specific program, but also doing other master's programs in the same department of divinity. So people doing biblical studies, people doing theology, people doing science and religion, you know, all these different components, often very Christocentric in my school. The religious studies department is really the only one that's not Christocentric, but it was very interesting for me to be rubbing shoulders with so many Christians. It had never really happened to me before in my life. It was interesting and it was exciting. Everything was very new and different. The PhD, on the other hand, I really struggled with on a number of levels, and like I say, you know, you have already heard me talk about this. I struggled with loneliness, and I had friends. I still had a lot of friends. I still had people to go and hang out with, but I struggled a lot with not having classes to go to, not having kind of a daily routine of going into college and meeting people, going for lunch and that kind of thing, and just doing something communally and talking about our research, talking about what we were reading with one another. You know, we still went to the pub, I still met up with friends and stuff, but definitely less. I was also in a new relationship, and I think the two things kind of came together in a bad way, maybe, that like sometimes when you're in a relationship it's easy to sort of get complacent about your socializing, about your friends, because you're already kind of filling up your social needs quite a lot, you know, in that relationship. So that ended up being kind of a negative in that regard for me as well. Even though, you know, it was a wonderful experience, that relationship was a wonderful experience, but yeah, I think that also played a role in that kind of, I just got myself into a not brilliant place in terms of my friends and socializing, social groups and so on in the first year or two of my PhD. And I think, yeah, the biggest problem really was just not having people to talk to about my research. So if you're someone who's thinking about doing research, if you're thinking about going into a PhD program or any sort of research postgraduate program, I know I've said this before in the channel, but I really would recommend that you really try to find ways to be interacting with other people about your topic, about the stuff that you're reading. It can be difficult, but it might be easier in other kind of areas. So what I found was that in religious studies, even though there was, you know, maybe 5 other people who were either currently doing a PhD program or had recently finished that I would be hanging out with on a regular basis, none of us were really reading any of the same stuff. We weren't drawing on the same material. We were all studying very, very different topics. And so we really just never talked to each other about our research. And we went to research seminars and so on, where we would have guest lecturers coming in, but again, their research was just never really much to do with mine, and was never really very relevant. And I never really figured out a way to get around that and a way to find just more dialogue about what I was doing and more people to kind of bounce ideas off and so on. I would think that that's actually very important, especially if you're extroverted like I am. If you're introverted, maybe it's not so much of a problem, and maybe you are very happy to kind of just read in a vacuum, read by yourself with the help of your supervisor or your advisor, and maybe that would actually work for you. But for me, it was a struggle. I struggled with motivation, and I struggled, yeah, just generally with that. But the biggest problem for me, really, I'd say the biggest problem for me was that I was starting to feel as though the work that I was doing wasn't really important to me, that I wasn't really satisfied with just the output and with the way that I was approaching or having to approach the material that I was researching. I think for anyone who has never really been in that postgraduate research environment, it's hard to really understand the extent to which you really do get kind of pushed into a corner in terms of just the approaches you have to take and the angles you end up having to take on your research. it sounds from the outside, and I know this because this is exactly how I felt too. It sounds from the outside like, oh well, if it's a passion project, if it's something that I'm actually really interested in myself, then you know, I don't mind having to apply criticism. I'm excited to kind of apply criticism and apply kind of scholarly papers and to read what other people are saying about this stuff. And for some people, I think this does work, and I'm going to maybe try and talk about this at some point later on in this video too, because I do know a lot of pagan scholars who are very happy, seemingly anyway, as far as I'm aware, in their field, and they're very happy with the kind of work they're producing. And so this is probably a very individual thing. But yeah, I think it's very easy to underestimate just how little freedom you're going to have when it comes to doing this kind of research. And I don't think that this really changes as you go further into your career. I think if you find yourself early on in your master's degree or something, or even your undergrad degree, you know, if you're doing a dissertation or something, I think if you find yourself feeling frustrated with the way that your research keeps ending up just turning out, with the topics that you end up covering, that you just feel like it's not necessarily your best creative endeavor, that it's not exactly the heart of what you want to get to, I feel like I can guarantee you that's not going to change, because there's always going to be outside competing forces kind of pointing you in certain directions. You're always going to have to answer to either your supervisor, your advisors. You're going to have to answer to you know, committees that are deciding if they're going to give you funding or not. You're going to have to answer to peer review, so whoever is reviewing your papers for publication, to editors in academic journals and academic you know, publications of books and so on. You're always going to have to answer to whatever it is the methods are of your field, and whatever, you know, the norms are of your field. And I really think that breaking out of that can be quite difficult. If on the other hand, you know, you do you know, either like an undergrad dissertation or a master's degree, and you actually feel really satisfied with the research that you're doing, and you actually feel like it complements your interest, your personal interest in that material quite well, then brilliant, absolutely, that's fantastic, keep going. And I think that maybe you'll find it to be a lot more of a pleasant journey than I personally found it to be. So I do want to emphasize that I didn't see this dissatisfaction with the field across the board in my time as an academic. I think that especially a lot of the Christian scholars, they had less of an issue with this kind of thing. I would kind of know less about that and about what their concerns and issues might be. But more relevant to me than that really are the pagan scholars that I have come across, who do actually seem to be fairly satisfied with the work that they're doing, in that they have actually continued to aspire towards an academic career, or, you know, are actually well established as scholars in their field. It can often be difficult to tell sometimes if a pagan scholar is actually a pagan themselves. I haven't always known for sure, and sometimes people have kind of dabbled in the past and then moved on from it, but kind of continued in a scholarly fashion. I think they're a slightly different animal to me and those who are actually practicing pagans. But I definitely know at least two practicing pagans who seem to be kind of excited and satisfied scholars in their field. The trick to this, from what I can see, is that they tend to be more focused on historical and anthropological perspectives. So they are maybe more of a mind to be documenting and analysing the development of, analysing the history of certain practices and so on, doing field work, you know, going along to pagan groups and circles, writing about their practices, writing about what they're up to. So there's a strong element of documentation that has never really been my personal focus when it comes to academic work. This is what I kind of learned. I've got a very theoretical mind. I like to theorize, and unfortunately I found that side of my brain just doesn't really meld very well with my spiritual side of my brain. I've never been an historian. That's never been something that's appealed to me. So I have a feeling that that's maybe where the difficulty lies. So, you know, if you're someone who wants to do research on paganism and spirituality and so on, and you are very happy to kind of adopt that kind of historian's hat, that anthropological kind of role, adapt that role of sort of documenting, discussing, and I think for a lot of people this is very exciting to be kind of drawing connections between different developments of things, joining the dots and so on, with different trends and developments over time. Then I think this kind of career might be very well suited to you. But like I say, that just has never been my forte. It's never been my aim. I'm a much kind of big picture kind of thinker. I like to really kind of draw big picture theoretical conclusions. I like to think about human behavior and experience on a very kind of broad level. So I'm just not suited to doing that kind of intricate work that, you know, people like Ronald Hutton have done, for example, you know, just as a famous name of an historian who has addressed, not that he himself is a pagan, but that he has done some, you know, really excellent work on paganism. So that's pretty much the conclusion that I've come to. I have seen other people in my field be very dissatisfied with religious studies as well, but I feel like it's hard to make a comparison between my dissatisfaction and their dissatisfaction, because essentially all of my friends, certainly the ones who were dissatisfied with the field and have since kind of left academia, they finished their PhDs and said, that's it, I'm done, just like I'm doing. They are not religious, they're not spiritual, they don't have a practice, it's not a personal thing for them. So they're almost kind of on the opposite side, that maybe because they don't have personal experience to draw on, that it's not, maybe there's not enough of themselves invested into the work. I don't know, it's all speculation. But that's been the main thing that I've noticed. I seem to be relatively rare in that I wasn't able to take my personal enthusiasm for the topic and bring it to academia. But I just feel like I need to kind of put that out there into the world for anyone who is considering this as a career path or just as further education, to be prepared to pay close attention to how satisfied you really are feeling at an early stage with the kind of research that you're doing, with the kind of reading that you're doing. And really importantly, do you feel like it's bolstering and exciting you in terms of your spirituality or spiritual practice, or is it dampening it? Is it dragging you down? Is it weighing you down? Is it pulling your mind in two different directions and actually hindering that kind of creative spiritual thinking that you might be doing instead? I would really strongly recommend that you pay very close attention to that from the very beginning, and just be very honest with yourself about whether you think that you're going to long term be happy with that as a direction to go. Because, you know, for many of us, spirituality, spiritual practice, it can be a bit of a tenuous thing. It can be something that can be really kind of can blossom under certain circumstances and through cultivation with the right materials and the right context and so on. But for many of us, it's very easy to kind of let that slide and for that to just sort of fall away a little bit and to lose touch with it. And I think we all just have to be vigilant about, you know, even if we're doing work that we feel like we're good at, or that it comes naturally to us, ultimately, I think we need to be honest with ourselves and look at that work and say, yes, but do we find it meaningful? Are we actually doing the things, exploring the things that we want to be exploring? Because I can guarantee you that if you're exploring things that you actually don't care about, that you actually ultimately don't think are that important, then you will suffer for that. And that has been my experience. So I don't regret doing this PhD. I definitely don't regret it at all. I think over time I'm only going to see more and more of what I've gained and learned from this experience. I think it has shaped my mind in certain ways. It has given me new kind of cognitive abilities that I wouldn't have necessarily had in the past. It's kind of honed my mind to a certain degree, just through doing the process of doing this research. And that's really exciting. I feel like I'm actually just much more capable in my role as a mentor, as a spiritual mentor and so on now than I would have been 5 years ago before I started this. And I'm also very pleased to have had the time, the opportunity to spend so much time with this kind of material. It wasn't in the optimal way for me in the end of the day. It didn't turn out to be the best way for me necessarily to engage with that material. But at the end of the day, I have come out of it with a large body of knowledge and a bunch of ideas that I think are going to be interesting for me to take in my own direction over time, when I don't have those kind of external pressures on me to explore in certain directions and be restricted in terms of the ways that I can actually think about this material, think about what these people have been saying about the Dark Goddess, and really explore what that means for me, and really explore what my personal interpretations of that are and what my personal experiences of that have been. I think that's been the biggest frustration for me, is that there's no space in this kind of field. There may be in other fields such as theology, occasionally there's a little bit of space for personal experience, but generally speaking in academia, there's no room for personal experience. There's no room for you to just sort of, go exploring all these new ideas or different ideas and kind of reflect on that from your own personal spiritual experience and kind of follow that as your route towards what you're going to write about, what you're going to think about. It tends to have to just be kind of much more focused on just objective knowledge and the material that is in front of you. You end up doing a lot of analysing of words and themes, and that's certainly in the kind of work that I ended up doing, that's been my experience. To be completely honest with you, at this point in time, a lot of the time I'm sick to the teeth of the Dark Goddess and of this concept and of all of these themes and so on. But I think that's because I've got the Dark Goddess that is the Dark Goddess in my thesis, and then there's the Dark Goddess that I find interesting that calls to me. And those are not the same thing. And I think part of it is because if I'm reading a book about the Dark Goddess, if I'm watching YouTube videos, I'm not going to take every single thing of that and every single part of it and every single belief of that person and kind of integrate that into my own practice. I'm going to just kind of pick out certain parts that call to me and incorporate that and think about that, and does that relate to my understanding or not, and be able to kind of pick and choose. But of course, that's really not what you're doing in an academic context. You can't just pick and choose necessarily which bits you want to kind of follow up on, because you have to kind of be honest with your interpretation and be honest in your kind of representation of the material that you're dealing with. So, in one way, I'm kind of sick of the Dark Goddess and I'm not necessarily dashing into working on material around this again. But on the other hand, I kind of feel like I'm actually really excited, and I am actually looking forward to addressing this topic again. And I think that part of the solution for me is going to be dropping that title, Dark Goddess. I think it's a very contested title in the community anyway. It's one that I think a lot of people who are interested in the kind of themes that have been associated with this concept don't necessarily use that title anyway. And I think what I might be doing, at least initially, is jumping off some of those ideas that came to me while doing this research and just following them up and just really going back to personal experience and being able to write and make videos again about just my own personal ideas and what I feel in sacred space and what I feel in nature and so on. And that's going to be very, very different to the restrictions of being in an academic program. So then finally, I think the main thing that I haven't talked a lot about is the last year of the PhD for me, because I wasn't making videos for a good stretch of that, and I've just been frankly a bit sick of talking about it, I suppose, as well. But the last year has been unexpected, obviously because of COVID. I came back to Ireland, and around that time when I first came back, I was actually feeling very, very optimistic about the PhD. I had kind of come up with a focus in the research, a focus on narrative as my kind of key term, narrative spirituality as my key idea, that I was going to kind of center all of the kind of analysis that I had done, and I was going to center it all around that idea. And I was very excited about that because this was something that had interested me from a personal perspective. This was an idea, obviously, if you have been following me for long enough, you will remember Heart Story. You will remember that I have for a long time been really fascinated with the way that religion and spirituality interacts with story and narrative, and the way that we tell certain stories about ourselves, about our identities, about our place in the world, and so on. So I was excited about it just over a year ago, or about a year ago. I was writing a couple of, I was kind of drafting the last few chapters really, and feeling really optimistic. But then when COVID hit, everything kind of took a bit of a downturn, and I suppose I won't know if I might have been feeling more positive about the whole experience coming out of it if the world hadn't been such a strange place at the time that I was finishing up. I think I actually wrote a whole chapter in the first lockdown that we had in Ireland. I actually had the 7th chapter to I had notes, like a lot of notes, but I hadn't properly formulated it into a chapter, and I had already planned to go down to Kerry with my parents for a few weeks to write that chapter. And then, yeah, it ended up being in the middle of a global pandemic. So that definitely shaped the experience, because it was a struggle. It was a huge struggle for me to come to that computer every day, to sit down, to open up the chapter, to look at it, to write words, to formulate sentences, to kind of really pull it all together. Luckily, I had done the really hard work before that of restructuring the earlier chapters. Restructuring the middle chapters in the thesis was some of the hardest work that I think I've ever done. I'm no joke when I say that I was kind of literally pulling out my hair and crying at one point, because it's just, you get to that point where you just, you have to do something with it, you have to make some kind of sense of the structure of it, and you keep moving pieces around here and there, and like pasting in and out sections out of different chapters, and just none of it will kind of come together and make sense. So luckily I had sort of made sense of that by sort of the end of February, beginning of March, so just in time. But yeah, coming to that computer every day and having to kind of go through and write a whole chapter, and then make all of these edits, make all of these changes, pull the thing together, tidy it all up. It was really brutal, I have to say. I think at the very beginning, a very good friend of mine said, well, this might kind of be perfect timing for you. You're going to be sort of forced to just stay at home and work on this thing, and you're going to have to be sitting at home working anyway, and this way you don't have any distractions, right? Like, there's nothing else going on, you're not missing anything, so you might as well just do your PhD. But unfortunately, my experience was not of it being a positive thing, not the first time around anyway, when we had our first lockdown in Ireland. It was really brutal. So I think you have to kind of take all of my negative experiences, my negative perspectives on it at the end, with a pinch of salt, bit more than a pinch, because, it was such a difficult, especially the first kind of 3 months of that. It was really hard, and I really struggled with my mental health and so on. I'm very glad that I really started to come out of that before the PhD went in, so that I've been at a much more stable and optimistic and happy place at the time that I'm actually finishing up. And I'm feeling really optimistic for the future at this point. I'm really excited just to move on and start into all the projects that I want to be starting into. But I don't think that my experience has been remotely normal. I mean, even deciding to come home and finish the PhD from home rather than being in the kind of school environment that I had been in the past, not going into the office every day and so on. Even that was, a little bit unusual, and would have kind of produced an unusual experience of like relative isolation in the last year, in the kind of final, well, it was supposed to be 6 months, but it turned out to be kind of more like 9-10 months. But yeah, I'm losing the light here, so I'm going to kind of leave it there. But because I think I've pretty much said everything that needs to be said. I think I've pretty well kind of given you an overview of where I'm at and how I'm feeling about the whole situation, the whole process, the whole experience by now. And as I say, I don't regret it. I think over time I'm only going to be happier and happier that I actually went through this process. And sometimes I feel frustrated that I didn't just stop at the masters and then just get back to doing all the other stuff that I'm now going to start doing. I feel a bit like, I lost 4 years and I could have been doing all of this 4 years sooner. But life doesn't really work that way, does it? Like, I wouldn't have been the person that I am now 4 years ago. I know that I wasn't, and I don't know that I was actually ready at that point. And even though this PhD hasn't directly been, it hasn't trained me to, be a spiritual mentor, or to write material or make videos for you about spiritual topics, it hasn't necessarily directly trained me to help other people with their spiritual practices and so on. But I think indirectly it absolutely will. It absolutely has. It's opened up my mind to different ways of thinking. It's helped me be better at doing research and just finding material. If I need to find something for someone on a certain topic, it's just easier for me to do that kind of work. It's easier for me to kind of look at things analytically and to kind of see patterns and things and draw things together for people and so on. So it definitely was valuable, and I don't regret it at all. So yeah, finally, I think I just really want to say thanks to all of you for just kind of continuing to be there and follow the channel over the past 5 years. I feel a bit like, gosh, how long have I actually been making videos? I feel like it's been about 8 years at this point. And I feel, unfortunately, like probably the second 2 years, like years 2 and 3 were by far the strongest for me here on the channel, because that was when I was most focused on the channel and most focused on my own spiritual practice. And the last 5 years, gosh, it's honestly hard to believe sometimes that it's been that long. The last 5 years have maybe not been as inspired always when it comes to this, but so I want to thank all of you who have actually continued to follow me along, or who have found me along the way. And any of you who've been kind of, you know, wishing me well during the PhD process. I know so many of you have reached out, you know, whether it's, you know, replying to newsletters or commenting on videos or sending me emails. So many of you have reached out in whatever way to kind of wish me luck or to congratulate me and so on. And I really, really, really appreciate that. It's been so wonderful to know that all of you kind of have my back and are sort of, I don't know, interested to hear, you know, where I go from here and what I do with this material and so on. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there before I completely, you know, just, before I have absolutely no light on my face anymore and the room just goes into complete darkness. But yeah, as usual, thanks for watching. Yeah, as always, if you have any kind of questions or anything you'd like me to talk about further, do let me know in the comments down below, and I'll talk to you again soon.